For generations, a summer in Rhode Island wasn't complete without a trip to Rocky Point. Ask almost any Rhode Islander over 40 what Rocky Point tasted like, and they won't hesitate. Clam cakes, steamers, a bowl of chowder eaten at a long table inside a dining hall, big enough to seat 4,000 people at once. This wasn't just a clam shack with a few rides attached, it was one of the oldest amusement parks in America. It ran for nearly 150 years on the same stretch of Narragansett Bay shoreline. It survived 2 direct hurricanes. It hosted a sitting president making one of the first telephone calls anyone in New England had ever witnessed. Generations of families had their first date, their first job, their first roller coaster ride, all on the same patch of coastline. Grandparents who rode the same rides as their grandchildren, decades apart, on the exact same midway. And then, in less than a decade, it was gone. Not because people stopped coming, because the people running it had quietly been using the park itself as collateral for businesses that had nothing to do with clam cakes or roller coasters at all. And this all started with a steamship captain, a handful of Sunday school kids, and a few long tables set up under some trees. Chapter 1. A steamship captain's Sunday tables. In 1840, a man named William Winslow captained a steamship called the Argo. He used it to carry Sunday school classes out of Providence. Providence at the time was a growing industrial city, crowded and increasingly built up, and a boat trip out onto open water offered families a genuine escape from all of it, however brief. He'd bring the kids to a quiet, wooded point of land jutting out into Narragansett Bay. There wasn't much there yet, just trees, rocks, and a view of the water. But the trip itself became something families looked forward to. Boat rides were still a novelty for most working families in the 1840s. A day away from the city, spent near open water, was enough on its own to draw a crowd. Word spread through church groups and neighborhoods the way it always did back then, slowly by conversation, one family telling another. Winslow noticed something simple. People kept asking to come back, so he decided to give them a reason to. He wasn't a businessman by training. He was a steamship captain who happened to notice an opportunity sitting right in front of him on land he already knew well from years of sailing past it. By 1847, Winslow had purchased a portion of that land outright. He and his wife, known locally as Mother Winslow, began setting up long wooden tables under the trees. They served shore dinners right there on the point. Clams, fish, whatever the bay provided that week. There was no formal restaurant, no walls, just tables, a view, and food pulled straight from the water nearby. Guests sat elbow to elbow on wooden benches, passing platters down the table the same way they might at a family gathering, because in a real sense, that's exactly what these meals felt like. That simple arrangement, a boat ride and a meal by the shore, was the entire business. It's easy to miss how ordinary this beginning really was. There was no grand plan to build an amusement park. Winslow wasn't chasing some larger vision of an entertainment empire. He was simply giving people a reason to get on his boat more than once. Everything Rocky Point eventually became, all 150 years of it, started with exactly that. A captain, a handful of kids, and a few tables under some trees. Chapter 2. Building a resort. Winslow's little shoreline stop didn't stay little for long. In 1865, he sold the property to a man named Byron Sprague, a Rhode Island businessman looking to expand into the growing shoreline resort trade. 4 years later, in 1869, it changed hands again, this time to the Continental Steamboat Company. That company brought in a manager named Randall Harrington, and Harrington had bigger ambitions than clam dinners under the trees. He saw a shoreline property with real potential, sitting close enough to Providence to draw a steady crowd, but still quiet enough to feel like a genuine escape. Harrington built up the property into a genuine resort. He added real structures, real attractions, and real infrastructure to bring in visitors by the boatload, quite literally, since steamships remained one of the easiest ways to reach the point. A rail line eventually reached the area too, giving visitors from Providence a second way to arrive besides the water. By 1918, an advertisement for the park billed it as New England's most beautiful amusement park, claim Harrington's investment had made increasingly believable. Part of what made the park genuinely beautiful was the work of one specific craftsman, Charles Looff. Looff was already becoming one of the most respected carousel and amusement ride builders in the entire country, and he built Rocky Point, a Ferris wheel that quickly became one of its signature attractions. Looff would go on to build the famous carousel at nearby Crescent Park too, but Rocky Point got him first. His work carried a distinct style, hand-carved and ornate, the kind of craftsmanship that turned a simple ride into a genuine piece of folk art. One of the park's stranger, more memorable additions during this era was a circle swing, a ride that spun riders out in wide arcs on long chains. Rocky Point built a version of this ride that swung its riders directly out over the ocean itself, chains stretching passengers over open water with nothing beneath them but the bay. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too strange to be true, and it's exactly the kind of thing that made this park's reputation. Visitors talked about that swing for years afterward, describing the strange thrill of looking straight down at open water while strapped into a spinning ride with nothing but a chain holding them up. Harrington's expansion set a pattern the park would follow for the next century. Build something distinctive enough that word travels well beyond Rhode Island's borders, then keep adding to it season after season, never quite satisfied with what already existed. That restlessness, that constant appetite for one more attraction, one more reason to visit, would define Rocky Point's growth for generations to come. Chapter 3. A President's Phone Call. By the 1870s, Rocky Point wasn't just a regional curiosity anymore. It was significant enough to draw the attention of the President of the United States. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes visited Rocky Point directly. He sat down for the same shore dinner regular visitors had been eating for 30 years by that point. Clams, chowder, whatever the bay had provided that week. But Hayes's visit is remembered for something else entirely. While he was there, Rocky Point hosted one of the first public telephone demonstrations anyone in New England had ever witnessed. Telephones were still an almost unbelievable novelty in 1877. Alexander Graham Bell had only patented the device the year before. For most people in Rhode Island, a working telephone call was something they'd only heard described, not something they'd actually seen happen. Rocky Point gave a crowd, gathered on a quiet shoreline point that had started as nothing more than a spot for Sunday school picnics, the chance to witness it firsthand. People reportedly lined up simply to hold the device, to speak into it, to hear a voice come back through a wire stretched somewhere out of sight. Some accounts describe grown men and women reacting with genuine disbelief, convinced for a moment that some kind of trick or illusion had to be involved. It's worth holding on to this detail because it says something real about what Rocky Point had already become in just 30 years. This wasn't simply a place to eat clams anymore. It was significant enough, visible enough, and well-connected enough to host a sitting president and one of the most important technological demonstrations of the entire decade. A place that started with a few tables under some trees had become, within a single generation, a genuine stage for American history. The kind of spot organizers picked specifically because they knew it could draw a crowd worth impressing. Local newspapers covered the presidential visit extensively, describing the crowds that gathered along the shoreline just to catch a glimpse of Hayes. For a park barely 30 years removed from its origins as a handful of picnic tables, hosting a president was proof the place had genuinely arrived, not just as a local curiosity, but as somewhere that mattered on a much larger stage. Chapter 4. Fire, Rebuild, and the Blue Laws. Growth rarely comes without setbacks, and Rocky Point's first serious one arrived in 1883, when a major fire tore through the property. The fire reshaped the park's entire identity going forward. Before 1883, Rocky Point had leaned heavily on its resort character, dining, scenery, a place for leisurely visits. After the rebuild, the park shifted its emphasis toward rides, performances, sports, and the kinds of active attractions that would define amusement parks for the next century. The fire didn't end Rocky Point. It redirected it, pushing the property toward exactly the identity most Rhode Islanders would come to know it by. One of the stranger episodes in the park's history happened 2 decades later, in 1903, and it had nothing to do with rides or dinners at all. Boston had strict Sunday blue laws at the time, laws that restricted certain commercial and entertainment activities on the Sabbath. On Sunday, September 6, 1903, those laws prevented the National League's Boston Bean Eaters from playing a scheduled game against the Philadelphia Phillies at their usual home field. Rather than cancel the game, the two teams simply moved it. They played it instead at a field on the Rocky Point property, where, according to the accounts that survive, the ocean came right up to the edge of the outfield. Boston won that day, 3-2, in a Major League Baseball game played beside Narragansett Bay simply because Rhode Island's laws were looser than Massachusetts. It's hard to imagine a modern Major League team relocating a game on a few days' notice to a field beside the ocean. But in 1903, Rocky Point had exactly the open space and exactly the right legal loophole to make it happen. Local fans who couldn't normally afford a trip to Boston to see a Major League game got, for one strange afternoon, a genuine big league contest right on their own shoreline. Around this same era, the park added the Russian toboggan, a flume-style ride that became one of its signature attractions. It would go on to have its own dramatic ending decades later, one tied directly to a storm nobody at Rocky Point could have stopped. The rebuild after the 1883 fire also brought a wave of new investment into the property's overall design. Walkways were widened. New concession stands appeared. The park's owners, having just watched a fire nearly undo decades of growth, seemed determined to build something sturdier and more ambitious than what had existed before, setting the stage for the resort's continued expansion into the 20th century. Chapter 5. 2 Hurricanes. Most amusement parks never have to survive a direct hurricane hit. Rocky Point survived 2. The first came in 1938, in what's still remembered in New England simply as the Great Hurricane. It struck the coastline with devastating force, and Rocky Point, sitting directly on Narragansett Bay with nothing shielding it from the open water, took a serious beating. The Russian toboggan, that flume ride built decades earlier, was destroyed outright in the storm. Waves reportedly reached areas of the park that had never seen flooding before, and cleanup crews spent weeks simply clearing debris before any real rebuilding could even start. Photographs taken in the storm's immediate aftermath show entire sections of the boardwalk simply gone, torn away by water that had, only days earlier, been calm enough for a leisurely swim. Rocky Point rebuilt anyway. The park's owners and staff cleared the damage, repaired what could be repaired, and reopened for the following season, treating the hurricane as a setback rather than an ending. That decision, to rebuild rather than walk away, would repeat itself 16 years later under almost identical circumstances. 16 years later, in 1954, Hurricane Carol hit the same stretch of coastline, and Rocky Point took another direct beating. Once again, the park rebuilt. Once again, it reopened. Longtime staff who had lived through both storms described a kind of grim familiarity the second time around, already knowing which buildings would need the most work, already knowing roughly how long the cleanup would take. It's worth pausing on what this actually says about the community's relationship to this place. A park sitting directly on an exposed bay shoreline, hit by 2 major hurricanes within a 16-year span, could easily have simply been abandoned after either storm. Plenty of coastal businesses, hit far less hard, never reopened at all after a single bad storm season. Rocky Point's owners rebuilt twice, and Rhode Islanders kept showing up both times. Whatever this place meant to people by the middle of the 20th century, it meant enough to rebuild from the ground up, not once, but twice in the span of less than 2 decades. Local accounts from after Hurricane Carol describe volunteers showing up unprompted to help with cleanup, neighbors, and regular visitors pitching in alongside paid staff to clear debris and get the park ready for another season. That kind of grassroots commitment doesn't happen for a business people merely tolerate. It happens for a place people genuinely consider part of their own lives. Chapter 6. What everyone actually came for. Ask anyone who grew up going to Rocky Point what they remember, and the shore dinner hall comes up almost immediately. By the mid-20th century, this wasn't a handful of tables under trees anymore. It had grown into a genuine dining hall, seating more than 4,000 people at a single time, widely billed as the largest shore dinner hall on Earth. The menu had stayed true to its roots the entire way. Clam cakes, fried in hot oil until golden, served alongside steamers, lobster, and a bowl of New England-style clam chowder that Rhode Islanders would argue, with real passion, was the only correct way to make it. Long tables, packed with families, the smell of frying seafood carrying out toward the water. For generations of Rhode Islanders, this specific meal, eaten in this specific hall, was simply what summer tasted like. Servers moved between tables carrying trays stacked high, the noise of thousands of conversations blending into one steady hum that regulars remember almost as clearly as the food itself. Music and community life had their own home here, too. The Palladium Ballroom, built in the late 1950s alongside the Windjammer Lounge, hosted concerts from touring musical acts alongside weddings, sports banquets, and some of Rhode Island's most significant political gatherings. This was a building that held both prom nights and press conferences, both first dances and campaign rallies. Local politicians reportedly considered a Palladium appearance close to a required stop on the campaign trail, since so much of the state's population passed through its doors at some point every summer. Couples who married in that same ballroom decades apart could point to the exact same dance floor, the exact same windows overlooking the bay, unchanged season after season. The rides themselves grew and evolved across the decades, each new addition becoming its own piece of local folklore. The Skyliner carried riders above the park in an open gondola lift. The corkscrew loop roller coaster gave a generation of Rhode Island teenagers their first experience of riding fully upside down. The log flume soaked riders on hot summer afternoons. And the free fall, one of the park's later additions, dropped riders 13 stories at 55 miles an hour, a genuine thrill ride that could hold its own against anything at a bigger, more famous park. Kids measured their own bravery by which rides they were finally tall enough to get on. And getting cleared for the corkscrew was its own small rite of passage among Rhode Island children for decades. In July 1936, the park's saltwater swimming pool hosted actual tryouts for the 1936 Summer Olympics, a detail that still surprises people who assume Rocky Point was always just a local curiosity rather than a legitimate national caliber facility. Competitive swimmers from across the region descended on the park that summer, treating the same pool local families used for casual afternoon swims as a genuine proving ground on the road to Berlin. Beyond the rides and the food, Rocky Point held something harder to measure, a kind of open community access most amusement parks never offered. The park's grounds gave local fishermen free access to the point itself, prized for its striped bass fishing. Older Rhode Islanders would simply park along the shoreline for the view, which former U.S. Senator John Chafee once called a three-bridge view, a single sightline stretching across three separate bridges spanning Narragansett Bay. Rocky Point wasn't only a business, it was a shared piece of the state's own geography, open to people who never bought a single ticket. Seasonal jobs at the park became their own rite of passage for local teenagers. Working the skee ball counter, running a ride, or frying clam cakes in the shore dinner hall kitchen was often a Rhode Island kid's very first paycheck. Decades later, those same former teenage employees would bring their own children back to the same midway, pointing out exactly which booth they used to work, which ride they used to operate. Chapter 7. The most popular attraction in Rhode Island. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, Rocky Point had become, by a wide margin, the single most visited attraction in the entire state of Rhode Island. This wasn't a modest regional draw competing quietly for a share of the local market. It was the destination, the place families across the entire state built their summers around, generation after generation, the same way earlier generations had built theirs around the shore dinner tables. Winslow first set up in 1847. Local newspapers routinely referred to it as simply the Point, a shorthand that only makes sense for a place everyone in the state already knew without needing further explanation. But even at this peak, the same forces reshaping amusement parks across the entire country were quietly gathering. Six Flags opened a major park in nearby Connecticut, giving New England families a bigger, flashier, more nationally branded alternative within driving distance. Lake Compounce, another Connecticut park, kept reinvesting aggressively in new rides and attractions year after year in a way that made older parks look increasingly dated by comparison. And as the country and the region grew more affluent through these decades, families who once considered Rocky Point their big summer trip now had the means to consider Disney instead, a destination operating on a scale no regional shore park could ever hope to match. None of this hit Rocky Point all at once. For now, in these peak decades, the park was still thriving, still the undisputed heart of a Rhode Island summer. But the competitive ground underneath it was shifting in ways that would matter enormously within just a few more decades. Rides that had felt cutting edge in the 1960s started to look modest next to what national chains could now afford to build. A single regional park, however beloved, was never going to keep pace with companies operating dozens of properties at once. There's a version of this story that could have played out differently. Plenty of regional parks facing the exact same pressures found ways to survive, reinvesting steadily, finding a niche, staying financially disciplined, even as bigger competitors emerged nearby. Rocky Point had every opportunity to be one of those survivors. Its brand loyalty in Rhode Island was, if anything, stronger than almost any regional park in the country. What ultimately doomed it wasn't really the competition at all. It was a decision made far from any midway, inside a boardroom, about how to use the park's own assets. Chapter 8. Borrowing Against the Bay. The real story of Rocky Point's collapse doesn't start with declining attendance or outdated rides. It starts with a financial decision made quietly behind closed doors years before most visitors noticed anything was wrong. The company that owned Rocky Point was privately held, controlled by a group of shareholders who also owned several other, unrelated businesses. Over a number of years, that ownership group began making large loans, using Rocky Point's own assets as collateral to fund those other companies. It's worth being direct about what this actually meant. Money and financial risk tied to America's oldest amusement park were being funneled into ventures that had nothing to do with clam cakes, roller coasters, or Narragansett Bay at all. Visitors buying tickets at the gate had no way of knowing any of this was happening. From the outside, the park looked exactly as healthy as it always had, its rides freshly painted, its dinner hall as full as ever, giving no outward hint of the financial obligations quietly piling up behind closed doors. Those other companies didn't succeed. Several of them ended up in Chapter 11 bankruptcy of their own, and when they failed, Rocky Point had no way to collect on the loans it had extended to them. The park had, in effect, been quietly bleeding money into failing side ventures for years, all while continuing to operate as Rhode Island's beloved summer destination on the surface. Employees kept their jobs. Rides kept running. Nobody outside a small circle of executives and lenders understood how precarious the underlying finances had actually become. In 1990, the crisis accelerated sharply. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation seized the Bank of New England and called in an existing $500,000 loan tied to the Rocky Point property. The park didn't have the cash on hand to simply pay it off. To avoid a bank foreclosure and auction, Rocky Point borrowed $5.5 million from a lender called Fairway Capital, at an eye-watering annual interest rate of 15.5%. For comparison, a typical commercial loan of that era might have carried an interest rate a fraction of that size. This wasn't a rescue. It was a desperate stopgap, the kind of borrowing companies only turn to when every better option has already closed. Lenders willing to extend credit at that rate typically do so precisely because they understand the borrower has run out of safer alternatives. That kind of interest rate doesn't solve a financial problem, it just delays it and makes it larger. By 1991, Severely overleveraged already, Rocky Point loaned out another $6 million to still more unrelated companies owned by its own shareholders. Critics at the time accused those same shareholders of trying to wring every last penny out of the park before the whole structure came down. Whether that was the explicit intention or not, the effect was the same either way. Money kept flowing out of the park's own accounts and into ventures with no connection to amusement rides at all, even as the debt attached directly to Rocky Point kept climbing higher. Bankruptcy court records from this era paint a fairly stark picture, loan after loan, extended to related companies that shared ownership, but nothing else with the park itself. None of that money ever came back. Every dollar that left Rocky Point for one of these side ventures effectively became a loss the park itself would eventually have to absorb, whether its shareholders intended it that way or not. Chapter 9. Bankruptcy. By November 1994, the math had finally caught up with Rocky Point entirely. Facing a looming tax lien foreclosure from the city of Warwick, the three corporations that made up the park's ownership structure, Captain Rocky Incorporated, Rocky Point Amusement Park Incorporated, and Kitty Land Incorporated, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Court records showed the companies claiming $9 million in debts, owed to 145 separate creditors. That's a genuinely staggering number of creditors for a regional amusement park. Evidence of just how tangled the finances had become across years of unrelated borrowing and lending. Remarkably, the park still managed to open for the 1995 summer season, operating under the cloud of ongoing bankruptcy proceedings while families kept showing up for clam cakes and roller coasters as if nothing was wrong. Most visitors that summer had no idea they were watching the park's last real season unfold in real time. Lines formed for the corkscrew the same as always. The shore dinner hall still filled every weekend. Vendors still restocked their booths every morning, staff still clocked in for their shifts, and nothing about the day-to-day rhythm of the park betrayed the financial storm raging behind the scenes. In October of 1995, a federal judge approved a reorganization plan, restructuring the debt and creating a new limited liability corporation to take over operations going forward. It wasn't enough. The 1995 season would turn out to be the last real season Rocky Point ever had, as the park generations of Rhode Islanders remembered. In 1996, ownership attempted one final comeback, rebranding the property as the Rocky Point Family Fair and filling it with rented rides rather than the park's own historic attractions. It was a genuinely sad attempt at a farewell, functioning less like a real relaunch and more like a going out of business sale dressed up as a summer season. The crowds that showed up were sparse. Longtime visitors, used to packed midways and hour-long lines for the corkscrew, walked through a diminished, rented version of the place they remembered, and most of them understood immediately that this wasn't a comeback. It was a goodbye. Some longtime staff members reportedly stayed on anyway, working that final strange season out of loyalty more than any real expectation the fair would succeed. A post from that summer, later preserved on an early online amusement park forum, captured the mood well. A visitor described walking the grounds and barely recognizing the place, the rented rides feeling wrong somehow. Temporary, nothing like the rides that had stood there for decades. It read less like a review and more like an obituary, written by someone who understood exactly what they were watching disappear in real time. That post would go on to be quoted and requoted for years afterward, cited by amusement park historians as one of the clearest first-hand accounts of what Rocky Point's true final season actually felt like from the inside. Chapter 10. The Auction. What followed was the same brutal liquidation process that's ended so many beloved American amusement parks. The rides themselves, sold off piece by piece to whoever would pay for them. The Corkscrew Loop roller coaster, one of Rocky Point's signature attractions, sold for $850,000 to Wild Waves Theme Park in Federal Way, Washington. Renamed the Wild Thing, it remains in operation there to this day, still carrying riders upside down decades after it first opened at Rocky Point, just 3,000 miles from the shoreline where it started. The log flume found a new home elsewhere too, continuing to operate at another park under different ownership. Piece by piece, the physical rides that had defined summers for generations of Rhode Islanders scattered across the country, each one carrying a small, mostly forgotten piece of Rocky Point's history along with it. The shore dinner hall, the true heart of the entire property, held on a season or two longer than the rides did, serving clam cakes and chowder to a shrinking but devoted crowd of regulars who weren't ready to let go. Staff kept the kitchen running even as the rest of the property emptied out around them, frying clam cakes in the same hot oil generations of cooks had used before them. Eventually, even that closed too, and the land that had fed Rhode Islanders for nearly a century and a half sat, for the first time since 1847, with no dinner service at all. The property itself sat abandoned for years afterward, its buildings decaying, its grounds slowly being reclaimed by weeds and salt air. Photographers and curious locals wandered the grounds during these years, documenting a slow, quiet collapse that stood in stark contrast to the crowded midways so many of them remembered from childhood. On September 2nd, 2004, arson finally destroyed what remained of the park's main structure, known locally as the Big House. Vandals set the fire deliberately, and what little was left of Rocky Point's physical infrastructure burned along with it. A place that had survived 2 direct hurricanes couldn't survive a match. News coverage of the fire drew an immediate, visceral reaction from Rhode Islanders across the state, even those who hadn't visited the park in years. Comment sections and letters to local newspapers filled with grief that seemed disproportionate to a building most people hadn't set foot in for the better part of a decade. But that reaction made sense to anyone who understood what the Big House actually represented. The last physical piece of a place that had shaped an entire state's collective memory, finally gone for good. Chapter 11. Rescued. For nearly a decade, the former Rocky Point property sat as exactly the kind of ruin so many other parks in this series have ended up as. Fenced off, deteriorating. A piece of collective memory with no clear future. Local news occasionally ran features on the site, usually framed around nostalgia and the question of what, if anything, might ever happen to it. Real estate speculation swirled for years, with rumors of condominiums, shopping centers, and marina developments all surfacing and fading without ever materializing into anything concrete. In July 2003, the U.S. Small Business Administration purchased the property for $8.5 million, taking it over as part of the bankruptcy resolution process. That sale didn't immediately solve anything. It simply moved the property into a different kind of limbo, government-owned, but still without any real plan for what would come next. Years passed with the site essentially frozen, too complicated to redevelop, too significant to simply ignore. That plan finally arrived in stages. On September 17, 2012, the Small Business Administration accepted an offer from the state of Rhode Island to purchase the property, with the explicit goal of converting it into a public state park. The following March, in 2013, the sale of the remaining 82 acres was formally conveyed to the state. The Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management took over operation and maintenance of the grounds going forward, beginning the slow process of clearing what remained and preparing the land for public use. In 2014, Rocky Point officially reopened, not as an amusement park, but as Rocky Point State Park, open to the public for the first time in nearly 2 decades. In a small, strange, fitting touch, the arch from the 1964 World's Fair in New York was relocated to the property, now rising above the same Rhode Island coastline, where a steamship captain once set up a few tables under some trees. Rocky Point, in its own way, had been rescued, not as the amusement park generations remembered, but as something the whole state could still access freely forever. Opening day for the new state park reportedly drew crowds of former visitors eager to walk the grounds again, many of them seeing the property for the first time since it closed nearly 20 years earlier. Some brought children who had only ever heard stories about the rides and the shore dinner hall. Others walked in near silence, simply taking in how much and how little had actually changed. Chapter 12. Rocky Point Today. Today, the 120-acre Rocky Point State Park draws walkers, joggers, cyclists, and fishermen along a gentle mile-and-a-half paved trail that loops the property. Families push strollers along the same ground that once held roller coasters. Dog walkers pass benches installed where a ticket booth or a ride entrance might once have stood. The park hosts community events too, from summer food truck nights to a New Year's Eve fireworks display that draws crowds back to the same shoreline for an entirely new kind of gathering. The fishing pier still stands, rebuilt in recent years, still drawing anglers after the same striped bass that made this point famous among local fishermen generations ago. The three-bridge view Senator Chafee once described is still there too, unchanged, stretching across the same water Winslow's steamship once carried Sunday school classes over in the 1840s. Scattered signs around the grounds tell visitors the property's history, alongside a handful of physical remnants. An old stairway, a weathered arch, faint traces of foundations where buildings once stood. Visitors sometimes stop at these markers for long stretches, reading the old photographs, matching them up against the empty green space in front of them. The shore dinner tradition itself never actually disappeared, even though the original hall did. In late 2025, the Rocky Point Chowder House opened in the food court of the Warwick Mall, explicitly built to carry the park's legacy forward for a new generation of Rhode Islanders, many of whom never got to visit the original park at all. As the mall's own announcement put it, for most Rhode Islanders, Rocky Point wasn't just an amusement park. It was part of growing up. And that identity apparently was worth preserving even without the rides, the dinner hall, or the midway that originally built it. An earlier attempt, the Rocky Point Clam Shack on Post Road, had tried something similar years before. Closing after a run of its own, proved that the appetite for this specific legacy has outlasted more than one attempt to properly serve it. Rocky Point never really got its amusement park back, and it likely never will. What it got instead was something closer to what it actually started as, back in 1847, a shoreline, a view, and a meal, open to anyone willing to make the trip. The rides are gone. The shore dinner hall is gone. But the coast is still there, and so somehow are the clam cakes. There's a version of the story that reads as pure loss, a beloved institution gambled away by people who should have known better. That version is true, but it isn't the whole picture. The land survived, the view survived, the recipe survived, moving from a shoreline dining hall into a mall food court without ever really losing what made it matter in the first place. Rhode Islanders lost their amusement park. They didn't lose Rocky Point entirely, not in the way so many other places on this channel have simply vanished for good, leaving nothing behind but empty lots and old photographs. So that's the story of Rocky Point. Now I want to hear from you. Did you eat at the shore dinner hall? Do you remember your first ride on the corkscrew, or the feeling of the free fall dropping 13 stories underneath you? Did you have a first date there, or a first job scooping ice cream or running a ride? Have you walked the new state park, and did it feel like the same place, or somewhere entirely different? Tell us your Rocky Point story in the comments below. The more specific, the better. Which rides, which summers, who you went with, and whether you've made it back since it became a state park. And if this story showed you what happens when the people running a beloved American institution quietly gamble it away on businesses that had nothing to do with the place at all, hit that like button and subscribe. We cover the places that built American summers and the decisions that ended them before anyone saw it coming.